In 1909, Geronimo lay on his deathbed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. He was one of the last Native Americans forced to abandon his traditional way of life. Geronimo had fought against the Americans for 25 years as part of the Apache Wars in the southwestern United States. During this time, he witnessed his people being driven from their lands, tortured, and killed, and he retaliated in kind. Although he was known as a fierce warrior at nearly 80 years old, dying from pneumonia, he was still enraged by being a prisoner. He regretted surrendering and wished he could have fought more, not against the United States, but against Mexico, which he despised for what they had done to his people. If it had been up to him, he would have returned to Mexico to continue fighting until his death. Today we're examining the brutal blood feud between the Apaches and Mexico, but before we dive into our story, please subscribe to the channel and give a like so you don't miss any videos. The Apaches had many reasons to hate various groups. For 2 centuries, they were in constant war with the Comanches and fought a 25-year war against the Americans, which destroyed their way of life. However, for many Apaches, the hatred for these groups paled in comparison to what they felt toward Mexico, and with good reason. Depending on how you count, the Apaches were at war with Mexico intermittently since the 17th century when the territory was controlled by the Spanish. The Apaches' refusal to submit to Spanish rule and their constant raids on settlements led to an extremely contentious relationship. By the late 1700s, the Comanches and the Spanish joined forces against the Apaches in a literal attempt to exterminate them. They were so effective that by the 1790s, Apache raids had nearly ceased, and many were forced to leave the plains and seek refuge in the mountains. Thousands of Apaches, out of necessity, made peace with the Spanish, living in Spanish villages, attending schools, and adopting Spanish names and customs, including Catholicism. To keep the Apaches pacified, the Spanish provided food rations. However, when Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821, the new government tried to maintain the rations, but resources were scarce. By the early 1830s, the subsidies were withdrawn, leading the Apaches to leave Mexican towns and resume raiding to meet their needs. Apache raids on Mexicans increased, mainly targeting resources like cattle, horses, food, weapons, and ammunition, which inevitably led to violence. The Mexican government tried to make peace with the Apaches, but internal fragmentation among the tribes and bands made it difficult to implement lasting agreements. Additionally, the Apaches struggled to understand Mexican institutions, believing that agreements made with one town didn't apply to others, resulting in continued conflicts. In 1833, the raids intensified, leading the Mexican government to dedicate more resources to solving the problem, including hiring additional soldiers and implementing strict self-defense policies. In 1835, the Mexican government instituted a bounty for the scalps of adult Apaches, and the capture of women and children resulted in slavery. The brutal treatment of the Apaches by the Mexicans only fueled the cycle of violence and revenge. The Apaches, masters of their environment, often escaped capture. There were notable cases, like that of a woman named Francesca, who escaped her captors and killed a mountain lion with a knife, later marrying Geronimo. Deceptions and ambushes were also common, like the Santa Rita massacre in 1837, where a group of Apaches was betrayed and killed by Mexican soldiers after being lured with promises of gifts. The relationship between the Apaches and Mexico is an example of how conflict and cultural misunderstanding can lead to centuries of violence and resentment. The Apache struggle for survival and autonomy amid the invasion of their territories is a narrative of resistance and determination against relentless adversity. All those scalp bounties, slavery, and betrayals backfired terribly for the Mexican government. The leadership believed that brutal punitive expeditions would deter the Apaches, but it didn't work. The Apaches were a resilient people, it took a combined effort from the Spanish and Comanches to subdue them in previous decades. After Juan José's death at the hands of John Johnson's group, he was replaced by Mangas Coloradas, perhaps the most talented war chief the Apaches ever had. He led retaliatory raids against the Mexicans in Santa Rita, with one of the most notable being the attack that resulted in the death of 22 fur trappers. The locals were so frightened they fled to the nearby Presidio of Llanos. Along the way, about 300 to 400 were killed or captured by the Apaches, resulting in the closure of the Santa Rita copper mine for nearly 35 years. So, did the Mexican government learn anything? Did they consider a different approach? Of course not. That's not how blood feuds work. In 1839, they raised an army of 200 men to further crush the Apaches, led by an American named James Kirker. Kirker was effective, but as often happened between the United States and Mexico, he adopted an "any-Indian is a bad Indian" approach and ended up killing friendly Apaches who were negotiating peace. This only escalated the violence. The Apaches had another chief besides Mangas Coloradas who was very effective in leading warriors. His name was Victorio. When the Americans tried to force his band to move to the San Carlos Reservation, he refused, seeing life on the reservation as a form of slavery. To avoid the Americans, he went to Mexico, where he considered the Mexicans invaders of their traditional lands. After a series of raids, the governor of Chihuahua secured a meeting with Victorio. Many Apaches spoke at least some Spanish, so translation wasn't a big issue. The governor didn't even try to negotiate an end to the raids. He pleaded with the Apaches to limit their thefts to male cattle, fearing that the herd population would collapse if they continued taking the females. Victorio accepted this part of the conversation but was enraged when the governor demanded an end to the killing and scalping of Mexicans. Victorio stated that the Apaches didn't historically practice scalping, it was a practice they adopted from the Mexicans when the government put bounties on their heads. He also made it clear that he knew the bounties had been withdrawn in the 1850s because the Mexican government was paying for the scalps of people who weren't Apaches. During the 1830s and 1840s, between the Mexican states of Chihuahua and Sonora, about 6,000 Mexicans and perhaps 1,000 Apaches were killed. This brings us back to Geronimo. The blood feud between the Apaches and Mexicans is undeniable, and Geronimo personified this hatred. In the summer of 1858, 400 Mexican soldiers attacked an Apache village near Llanos. Geronimo and the other Apache men were away from the village trading when the soldiers attacked, killing many Apaches, including Geronimo's wife, his mother, and his 3 children. From that point on, Geronimo vowed revenge against Mexico. In 1859, he gathered a war party and raided Sonora, a place that used to be the state capital until Apache raids forced Mexico to relocate the capital. The party killed and scalped any man they encountered and captured women and children, but this was just a lure. When the kidnappings and murders were discovered, the town sent troops into the mountains, where the Apaches were waiting. Geronimo led the attack, recognizing the cavalry as the same soldiers who had participated in the massacre of his family the previous year. Fueled by his desire for revenge, he fought fiercely, killing several soldiers. A notable part of this story is that it was supposedly at this moment that Geronimo received his name. His birth name was Goyacla. Legend has it that during the final battle, the soldiers shouted a Geronimo, which could be a corruption of the name Saint Jerome, pleading for help. However, this version is debated. Some historians believe the Spaniards simply had trouble pronouncing a Goyacla. Regardless, Geronimo's thirst for revenge against Mexico continued. Between 1859 and 1861, he returned to Mexico 4 times with war parties. By the 1870s, the rage had lessened but never completely disappeared. Mexican soldiers continued to track down Apaches, killing many, including Chief Victorio at the Battle of Tres Castillos in 1880. After Victorio's death, Geronimo, who was never a formal chief, became a leader for many remaining Apaches. During his famous escapes from San Carlos in the mid-1880s, he visited Mexico several times. The Apaches were seen as such a significant threat that the Mexican government provided several thousand soldiers to help the Americans capture him. Geronimo, like most Apaches, eventually surrendered to the Americans. He was sent east but eventually ended up at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where he contributed to his autobiography. In it, one passage stands out about his feelings toward Mexico: "I killed many Mexicans, I don't know how many. I often did not count them. Some were not worth counting. It has been a long time, but I still have no love for the Mexicans. They were always treacherous and malicious to me. I am old now and shall never go on the warpath again, but if I were young and followed the warpath, it would lead into old Mexico." The bloody feud between the Mexicans and the Apaches was brutal. The Mexican government tried to subdue them but failed, leading to an ongoing escalation of violence and hatred. Thank you for watching the